now, in answer to my question about the Eurosceptics, Cole's brow furrowed and he said brusquely, "I will not allow it. Ich mache nicht mit." For him there was just one red line. He would not let anyone stand in the way of Germany and like-minded countries which had chosen to bind themselves more tightly together. Later I saw signs of hubris in Helmut Kohl when he allowed himself to be the object of near adulation during ceremonies marking the moment when, after 14 years in office, he overtook Konrad Adenauer, West Germany's first Chancellor, as his country's longest-serving post-war leader. Yet, when his political career ended, it was with disgrace. He was forced to admit that he'd accepted unlawful and secret political donations, which he lavished on his allies and favourites to help himself and his conservative Christian Democrats to stay in power. In the end, it was an outsider to Kohl's inner circle from Eastern Germany who broke the silence and declared the Kohl era is over. Her name was Angela Merkel, and the rest is history.
William Horsley. Hundreds of millions of people are said to have tuned in to at least part of the Champions League final earlier this month, as Real Madrid beat Juventus 4-1 in Cardiff. The competition begins again next week, but the qualifying rounds are unlikely to attract such viewing figures. The Faroese champions versus the Kosovan champions hardly sounds gripping. But the match to be played in the Faroe Islands on Tuesday is a significant moment for the supporters in the Balkans, says Elizabeth Gowing, who wanted to learn more about the Eastern European club's history.
The name of Trepča 89 is resonant in Kosovo, but soon it might be echoing around the stadia of Europe. After winning a spot in the qualifying draw this year, the Trepča 89 football team will be the first from Europe's newest country to compete in the UEFA Champions League. The team is named for Kosovo's largest and most lucrative mine. Trepča, where lead, zinc and silver have been dug from the earth since ancient times, was once not just the industrial heart of Kosovo, but significant for all Yugoslavia. By the 1980s, Trepča employed 20,000 workers and accounted for 70% of the country's entire mineral wealth, with the third largest smelting capacity in the world. Trepča is reckoned still to hold 4,500 tons of silver, though for lack of investment they may never be mined. But perhaps it won't be from the glint of precious metals that the Trepča 89 players will draw their motivation when they take to the field for the Champions League. They will also be honouring the second part of their team name. The number 89 commemorates what is seen by Kosovo's Albanians as the mine's finest hour. The hunger strike, started by over 1,300 miners, that took place in 1989 to call for Kosovo's autonomy. At the end of 10 days, 50 hunger strikers were still barricaded in the mine and stayed there until a midnight operation by the Yugoslav anti-terrorist unit, who had to enter through the fire escape shafts to arrest the strikers. Trepča 89 Football Club president Abedin Zeka tells me that was the beginning of the breakup of Yugoslavia. That was the year that the world heard of Trepča, and the club is proud to be linked to the mine. Today, the majority of his players are Kosovars, and the majority of them are from the mining city, Mitrovica. Abedin is in his 50s and says that his club brings together the two things Mitrovica was always famous for, sport and mining. He recalls the days when Mitrovica was a city of opportunity. For example, when I was a boy, I swam here in what was then the only swimming pool in Kosovo. I go to visit the former swimming pool, accompanied by one of the Trepča miners. Clambering up a hillside, we push through blackberry and elderflower bushes, crowding into a drained, void space. We make our way by crumbled steps into the shallow end, trampling litter, where the golden-limbed boys of a previous generation used to dive for coins or for glory. In perhaps 40 years, the swimming pool will be indistinguishable from the land around it. The surrounding trees will have matted and overhung it. And only when an occasional hiker chances upon the curved plinth of its diving board, like a bit of Mayan architecture in a rainforest, will anyone wonder about the summers that were spent here. As I'm reflecting on time and tide, my guide says, "You know, we call this place Colonia Anglesa, the English colony." I don't understand him at first, Britain never had anything called colonies in the Balkans. Oh yes, he continues, the workers' houses, which we can see below us, were all built by the same British company which in the 1920s reopened the mines at Trepča that had lain unworked since medieval times. They built the golf course too, he says, laughing at my astonishment as he makes an expansive swing with his hand over the field above us. I look carefully. Now I've seen what a swimming pool can become, perhaps I can believe that the areas of sand and small unnatural hummocks in the coarse grass really could have been part of a golf course once. I try to imagine my British forebears, those 1920s engineers striding about in +4s with hickory clubs after a day in the mine's seamy, silvery embrace. I learned that once the Second World War broke out and Kosovo fell under Axis control, these mines were taken over by Goering's private company and used to help production of U-boat batteries, powering the craft which prowled the Atlantic and plumed the oceans with destruction. I remember what Aberdeen told me about his football team, about to step out on the European stage. He was musing on its historic journey, from backing a hunger strike in support of his country's autonomy to seeing a Kosovo independent since 2008 and now playing internationally. We want to make sure that Trepča is not forgotten, he said. But in commemorating these mines, I realise it is my country's history too that is being kept alive.
Elizabeth Gowan. Cubans take Father's Day pretty seriously. On the third Sunday in June, the island more or less grinds to a halt as families celebrate their dads. This year, it came days after President Trump reimposed certain travel and trade restrictions, eased in his predecessor's diplomatic thaw with Cuba. In a speech in Miami, Mr. Trump warned the Cuban government that it had to improve its human rights record before any further progress could be made between the two countries. But Cuba rarely reacts to such external pressure, insisting that any changes will come from within the island. This week in Havana, Will Grant saw one small change come from an unlikely source.
My father-in-law, Carlos Galeano, is probably Cuba's best-known film critic. He hosts a cinema show on state television called Historia del Cine, the history of cinema, which has been running every Monday for decades. The show is an institution. It's hard to walk down the street with Carlos in Havana without someone recognizing him. The format is very simple. Carlos opens the program with the line, "A very good evening to our friends and viewers," and then talks directly at the camera about the evening's chosen movie. Then they play the film. It reminds me of an Open University broadcast, or the kind of show one used to see late at night on BBC Two when I was a kid. I'm biased, but his analysis of cinema is brilliant. Whether it's a John Ford Western or Harold Lloyd, whether Gone with the Wind or Kramer versus Kramer, Carlos goes to the nub of the movie and explains it to his audience without ever talking down to them. Plus, like all good film buffs, he throws new light on old pictures, even movies you've seen half a dozen times before. The day after Father's Day, I settled down for Historia del Cine, as I knew it was going to be a big one. "A very good evening to our friends and viewers," began Carlos, wearing a formal jacket and smart shirt. Finally, we have the opportunity to premiere tonight in our country, in its digitally remastered format, the controversial British film, A Clockwork Orange. I don't know if there was a sharp intake of breath at the home of some high-ranking member of the Cuban Communist Party, perhaps a censor or undersecretary for audio-visual affairs, but I like to think there might have been. Showing Stanley Kubrick's 1971 masterpiece was closing an overdue account with Historia del Cine viewers, Carlos said, before explaining quite why the movie had been so controversial in its day. For those that don't know it, Stanley Kubrick's incredible piece of cinema, based on Anthony Burgess's book of the same name, is set in a dystopian, futuristic London. Alex DeLarge, played by the inimitable Malcolm McDowell, and his gang of droogs wreak havoc at night, engaging in what Burgess called ultra-violence. They have pitched battles with other gangs and go on violent sprees, beating up vagrants, stealing cars, entering homes, robbing and raping their victims. But as Carlos pointed out on Cuban TV, Kubrick distances the viewer from the shocking violence, partly through the clever use of the soundtrack, specifically Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and Singing in the Rain. Mind you, that didn't stop the British tabloids rounding on him at the time, blaming the director for any act of youth violence in the UK after the film's release that seemed to echo the actions of Alex Delarge and his droogs. When Kubrick received death threats, he asked Warner Brothers to pull the film from British cinemas. Still, to me, the film is less about ultra-violence and more about social redemption and institutional control in a totalitarian society. Ultimately, Alex is forced to conform to the state's twisted rehabilitation methods. That message, rather than the fighting or sex, was probably why it hadn't been shown to the Cuban public in 45 years. Carlos admitted to being proud to have got this one on the island's airwaves. I think it is the most important and historic edition of Historia del Cine in 44 years of making the programme, he told me. So, I asked him, what did the fact the authorities let an uncut version of the film be publicly broadcast say about changing attitudes in Cuba? I think it's a sign of a new maturity here, he answered in typically carefully measured words, rather than anything to do with the opening. In Cuba, that opening refers to the political, economic and cultural thaw with the United States. However, it's recently taken a beating. President Trump has just retightened trade and travel restrictions eased by his predecessor, a move the Cuban government called retrograde, and a return to the failed Cold War policies. Many Cubans had hoped such days were behind them. Whether mature or not, they fear President Trump has turned back the clock on them too.
Will Grant. The life of a foreign correspondent can be a nomadic one. Moving countries every few years can come with great opportunities to meet new people and to learn new things, but it has its challenges too. After almost 2.5 years in Mexico, Katie Watson has just moved to Brazil, prompting her to reflect on the influence that different countries have had on her life and her identity.
Where are you from? It's a simple question most people don't give a second thought to, but for me, it's a conversation starter that I often would rather avoid. My answer is long-winded and awkward. Usually it goes something like this. Well, I'm not from anywhere in the UK because I was born in Hong Kong and lived there for the first 9 years of my life. Usually at this point people say, "Ooh, how interesting that must have been," and want to know more, how my British parents ended up living there, that sort of thing. But it is an odd thing not to be able to place myself in the UK despite being British. My mother is from Birmingham and my father's family spent time in Chatham and Bath, but they weren't places I ever lived in, so my Britishness is rather complicated. Of course, saying I'm from Hong Kong comes with its challenges too. I'm not Chinese, so do I really come from Hong Kong? I usually settle on telling people that now I have a house in London with my partner, so that's where I guess I'm from, or at least it's the place I would return to. There's a term for the type of person I am, apparently. I'm a TCK, a third culture kid. That means somebody who was brought up in a culture other than that of their parents. So you marry one culture with another and produce a third, I guess. Hong Kong was the place where I first went to school, where I met my best friend Anthea, and where family friends were actually more family than friends. It's the place that defined me, that gave me my love of living abroad, of meeting new people and learning about different ways of life. It also encouraged me to learn languages. No, sadly, I never learnt much Cantonese beyond being able to count to 10 and say Happy New Year. But I did study French, then Spanish, Italian and now Portuguese. I may not be able to pinpoint my geographical home, but my nationality was clear on paper. I was an expat kid with only one passport, British. But now I've complicated things somewhat. In November last year, I had a baby. Like mine, Wilfie's parents are both British citizens, but he was born in Mexico, so he's Mexican too. He even got his Mexican passport before he got his British one. Of course, there are some people who might not see him as Mexican. Even one of the nurses, when I told her he'd be Mexican, said, "Yeah, but it's not real, is it?" And that stung a little. Because how do you define nationality? Is it just where you were born, or is it about doing time in a country? If